Hello and welcome back to Base 911. This is going to be a recap episode for this week's base submitted by Looper17. When we started this base at the start of the week, roughly 20 cycles ago in game time, this base had a bunch of things going wrong all at once. It had a major oxygen problem. There was basically no oxygen anywhere in the base. He had run out of algae, so he wasn't producing any more algae or any more oxygen through that means. He had a very limited water supply, so electrolyzers were going to be something that needed to take just a little bit of work to set up. He had a bit of a food issue. He had stored roughly 100,000 calories of food, and one thing I did forget to mention when I started this, he is on easy settings when it comes to food for his guys, so each of these dupes are consuming half of what they normally would. But nonetheless, he had only a few cycles left of food, and all of his farms had gone offline because of either temperature or pressure. He had huge stress problems. All of his duplicants were freaking out. He had germ problems. He had power problems. He had completely run out of coal, and his power grid was failing everywhere. All sorts of issues with his base. No morale, no anything going on. And I think in the 20 cycles that we've had to play with it, we've turned things around quite a bit. Oxygen-wise, we can see we've got a lot of oxygen sitting around in the base. We haven't really done much to oxygenate this annex over here. We've got a little bit in these higher areas, but it's mostly just random other stuff the rest of here. But we've got oxygen supplies coming in. We have water to supply these electrolyzers coming in from basically a combination of this cool steam vent and melting ice from this ice biome. We're separating it out mechanically with this mechanical filter, so all the clean water is going up here and going into bathrooms, and the polluted water is coming out here. I've hooked it up to a water sieve, kind of ready to create some electrolyzer rooms. I'm not going to do that. There's a lot of guides out there. I think we've kind of spent enough time with the base to get it back on its feet. I do want to discuss in this episode the future challenges that this base will face and how you would want to address them. But I also want to discuss sort of how Looper17 got into the position that he got in and give some advice on how to avoid having this sort of base collapse in the future. Because right now, things are looking good, right? We've got plenty of food. We're up to around 300,000 kilocalories. We've planted all these farms, and they're up and operational. We've put in some heat management into the base, so we have a cooling loop right here to keep all these farms nice and cool. We have a cooling loop right here. If we go to temperature, right, we've created this cooling loop of hydrogen going through this cold biome that's keeping this area nice and temperate. That way our plants can continue to grow, right? So we've created a farming area inside of our base. We have dealt with the stress problems. The highest stress that we have is 1% on a couple duplicants. The germ problems are still kind of here, but we're dealing with them. The slime lung will be dealt with as we clean up the air, right? If we got rid of these morbs, which are probably a big part of why we still have some issues, that would help as well. We've kind of solved a lot of the power issues by creating some hamster wheels. We'd still want to go and dig out some big chunks of coal, like we have a bunch of coal right here. Where else does he have coal? Has some coal around here. Has some coal up around here, right? We want to go and dig out some veins of coal and probably use coal and smart batteries for our next power solution. But I'll get more into that as we talk about sort of the future challenges that the space would face. So we dealt with the stress. We've done some heat management solutions to keep his farms online. We've dealt with the food issues. We've dealt with the oxygen issues, and we have a pretty good water supply in these areas right here that we are pumping in for future use and more electrolyzers. And I kind of wanted to shift to what do I think went wrong with this base, and then we'll talk a little bit about what the future challenges are. So I think Looper17 kind of fell into a trap that a lot of new players fall into, which is that the way that the game kind of sets the pace for how challenges are thrown at you, it sets the pace based off of how many duplicants you have. That the basic mechanics of the game are such that the more duplicants you have, the quicker you're going to need to find answers to various problems. And that's fine for an experienced player because the more duplicants you have, the quicker you're able to build things, right? It's more labor that you're able to use to create the solutions to the problems that arise. But it's kind of like having a car that you've souped up to a really fast speed. If you're a novice driver and you don't know what turns and twists are going to come down the road, it's really easy to take your super fast, super powerful car and very quickly drive it into a ditch, right? All that extra power that you get, all that extra labor that you get from having more duplicants is also the thing that's prompting you to react to problems quicker. And so Looper17 basically followed a process of printing out a new duplicant every time one was available. And again, if you're an experienced player, that's fine. You can ultimately sustain quite a number of duplicants on a base. Once you get to the very late game and you're running rockets, you can send rockets to ice planets that will bring back water and methane and carbon dioxide and oxygen and all. Basically, just they'll bring back pure life support for your base, and you can use that to sustain a very large number of duplicants. Basically, you just have a bunch of rockets shuttling to bring back supplies to the base. But the way the game is geared, right, you start off with just 3 duplicants, and the challenge is, okay, you need to feed them and provide oxygen for them, right? And the quick and easy answer is you can turn dirt into food with using mealwood. You can turn algae into oxygen using either algae terrariums or these sort of algae deoxidizers. Are they still called deoxidizers? Oxygen diffusers is the new name for them. If you're an old school player, you'll remember them as algae deoxidizers. This is a better name. So these challenges start coming at you, but then you find out that dirt isn't really a renewable resource. You'll start running out of it, so you'll need to switch to some other food stuff. You'll find that the algae has run out and you'll need to do something else to support your oxygen production. And as you switch to these new technologies, as the finite resources that they give you at the start to run out, you have to encounter and deal with new problems. You start using electrolyzers, for example, but where are you getting your water and how are you dealing with the heat? You start saying, oh, I want to use mushrooms to supply my food. That means I'm going to go and gather some slime, but that slime is infected with slime lung, and now I need to know how to deal with the disease problems that creates. You want your duplicants to be able to do more advanced things to deal with these problems, but that means that these duplicants have higher morale needs, and they'll start getting stressed if you aren't meeting them, right? And problem after new problem starts getting introduced, and the timer on which these new problems are introduced is basically tied to how quickly you consume the finite resources that they give you at the beginning. And again, ultimately you can get to a state where you're sustaining a gigantic population of dupes, but that's kind of far down the road, and if you don't know how to get there from where you start, then you're going to run into the problems. And I think the most immediate sort of proximate problem that Looper17 ran into that he didn't know how to deal with was a buildup of carbon dioxide in his base. We see down here, he basically dug out these large areas and pumped a bunch of CO2 into them to try and deal with the carbon dioxide. Before I got rid of them, there were a bunch of carbon skimmers that he had built to remove carbon dioxide. Basically, he's had this buildup of sort of an unwanted gas, and he wasn't sure how to deal with it, and he kind of just ended up with the wrong solution. Carbon skimmers are a great building and have many uses, but the issue that they create is that they generate heat. If you want to have a renewable loop of carbon skimmers, you're going to need to send your water through a water sieve. That water sieve is going to output the water at 40 degrees. Basically, you're going to take your entire water supply and turn it to 40 degrees. And unfortunately, mealwood plants stop growing at 30 degrees. So he started trying to deal with his CO2, pumping it into areas, and when that wasn't enough, he started building carbon skimmers, and that started cooking his base. And we've cooled down the farm area that he had, that way it can continue running and producing more food. But everywhere else, as you can see, is around 40 degrees because of all the buildings that he's built around here that produce things at 40 degrees. So he created, in trying to solve one problem, which is how do I deal with the CO2, he kind of got a wrong answer and created a heat problem for himself, and then he wasn't sure how to deal with that heat problem. So he built a bunch of farms in a new area, but didn't quite get them online before he started running out of food. So he started making mush bars, but the mush bars consumed his water. And at this point, he also ran out of algae, so he hadn't switched really over to a new oxygen system. He had some electrolyzers built, but didn't have the water supplies to supply them anymore because he was using a lot of his water for food. And everything started kind of piling on. All the problems that he was encountering reached a head, and his base started going into a collapse. I think a large part of the answer is just not to take on as many duplicants at the beginning. That way you have more time to react and see if one of your solutions is working or not, and test whether or not this is a good answer or not. I think the real answer to CO2 buildup is kind of a variant of pumping your CO2 into some, storage area. But the storage area that I would use is either, if I was kind of more tolerant of exploits, I would put just a little bit of water over one of these gas vents, and then that will trick the gas vent into letting this room accept as much CO2 as you want. And so you can have a really high pressure room of CO2. And if you're like me, if you're a little bit less accepting of this as sort of an exploit, then what you can use, and we ended up having to research it under HVAC. He didn't have this research at the start, but these gas reservoirs are something that we can use to store gases. Each of these reservoirs will store roughly 150 tiles of this gas. So I could take all of the CO2 that is in, a very large area here. Here's 150 tiles, right? We could take all of that CO2 and store it in just one of these, right? And that's kind of a gas storage solution that I'm using up here. I want to save this hydrogen for later, ideally for space travel. You can hear more about that in other episodes that I've done. So I'm packing it into these gas reservoirs. I think a similar thing for CO2 would work. Another answer is because CO2 falls to the bottom of your base, he could just kept digging downwards and creating more area for his base, and that would have worked as well, right? If he just dug out more of this area, then he can support more CO2 just kind of resting down there. It's not a gigantic problem, CO2, because your duplicants only exhale, doesn't say exhaling. This person's not currently inhaling right now. Exhaling. Where's somebody? They have oxygen. I guess I just haven't. Let's let this run a little bit. Nope. Okay, well, duplicants will exhale 2 grams per second of CO2. And so even if you have, say, 50 duplicants, that's only 300 grams of CO2 per second, right? A single carbon skimmer could keep up with that. A single pump can pump out 500 grams per second of CO2. And since there's 600 seconds in a day, you're really only filling up maybe like one of these per day, right? So if every day you built another gas reservoir, then you could slowly just stack up your CO2. And then eventually, once you reach sort of the bottom of the map where the slicksters are, you could pump your CO2 down to them, and the slicksters would convert it into oil for you. So carbon dioxide is more of a resource than a threat, I think. And unfortunately, his sort of response to use a bunch of carbon skimmers generated a bunch of heat problems, which shut down his food production. I've shown off one of the solutions to heat problems right here. This area is all nice and cool because we have this coolant loop going through here, right? We've just sent a coolant loop of hydrogen through this cold biome. Eventually, this cold biome will warm up and stop cooling down this area, but it's a temporary solution that works just fine. There are a lot of heat management tricks that you can use. We could be heating up this water to say 90 degrees before we send it into a water sieve. I have a great video discussing how to set up a cooling loop with ice makers, right? So we could be using the ice maker building to cool down our base. There's a lot of tricks to heat management. It's one of the big mid to late game challenges that you face, so I can't really go after everything in one video. But knowing how to deal with CO2 and knowing how to deal with heat definitely would have helped him in this scenario. And I think that if you're a newer player and aren't sure how to meet all of the challenges that you'll encounter in the game, it's better to just have fewer duplicants. Fewer duplicants will mean you'll have more time to react, more time to figure out what's going on, more time to just kind of sit and let the problem get worse before it reaches a crisis point. Because really, the rate at which you consume food, the rate at which you consume oxygen, the rate at which you end up using up the water in your base, the rate at which everything that you need to do happens is basically tied to your duplicant population. And so even though there's no real problem in a sense of increasing your population, because that also increases the resources that you have to create solutions to those problems, for a newer player, I think it's just going to be something that's very overwhelming. So my advice in the future would be to slow things down, figure out the game systems at sort of a slower pace, accept less duplicants, be choosy about the duplicants that you accept, right? Only accept what you think are the best ones, and proceed from there. So that's my advice for how not to fall into the sort of trap that Looper17 fell into. As for steps that this base will need to take in the future to be sustainable, number one, eventually we're going to need to switch off of mealwood. We're down to 22.4 tons of dirt. That number will continue to fall as we grow more mealwood. We'll ultimately want to switch to something like mushrooms, of which I have some over here. Those will consume slime. When we start running out of slime, even though we have a pretty good amount of it left, we'll probably want to switch over to ranching, or we'll have found some water supply that can support some other new food option. Or maybe, like a lot of players, we just find more cold biomes and gather wild sleetwheat. There are a lot of options available to you in food, but one of the challenges that we're going to face down the line is switching off of mealwood to something else as dirt runs out. If that something else is mushrooms, we'll want to eventually switch off of mushrooms to something else as the slime runs out, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, there's food like Drecos or Paku or a bunch of things that you can ranch that basically generate you food for free. It doesn't take any resources, any input resources to create the food, and you'll eventually switch to probably one of those, unless you have extra resources from some other source to generate some other food stuff. That's usually what happens. This base eventually will also need to deal with heat management issues. Again, there's a lot of different answers to those heat management issues. It's a very doable thing. I've got a great guide on ice makers, which is a nice kind of early mid-game solution to heat problems that you can implement here. But eventually, right, it'll take a long time, but eventually this cold biome will all melt. All this negative 30-degree stuff will turn into 0-degree stuff or higher, and it'll be pumped out, melted, right? It'll turn into oxygen through our electrolyzers and this whole, liquid separation system. So eventually we're going to need to deal with that as well. I think the biggest problem, though, the hardest challenge that this base is going to face going forward is just finding more water to support the electrolyzers that are providing oxygen to the base. As kind of a good rule of thumb, you should expect on every single map that there is enough water-producing stuff to support about 45 duplicants, and only about 25 of that will be in the very easy-to-access stuff like cool steam vents. This cool steam vent is just going to vent out steam, and we're just letting it cool itself through this ice biome, and it comes out here at a reasonable temperature, right? It's here at 25 degrees. It's actually a little bit colder when it starts out. It's kind of picking up a little bit of heat as it dwells here, right? Because this is like 40-degree-ish area. But you'll need to find more water supplies, and you'll only have enough guaranteed water to supply around 25 duplicants off of cool steam vents. It can often be a lot more. You can have cool slush geysers or higher output cool steam vents or other things like that, but that's going to be one of the tricks. We've only found one of the two guaranteed cool steam vents on the map. There's some other one somewhere else around the base that we'll want to find. Any cool slush geysers, any natural gas geysers, anything that can produce anything that can then be converted into nice, clean, potable water is going to be important to find. And then eventually we're going to want to take the oil reservoirs that are on the map, and I believe there's 3 on every map, and we're going to want to pump water into them to get oil. We'll want to convert that oil into natural gas, and then we'll want to run that natural gas through natural gas generators, and that'll be able to supply about 20 more duplicants with the oxygen needs that they have because of the water that it creates. In addition, if we go beyond, say, 46 duplicants, where I've kind of brought them back up to here, we'd probably also want to start doing space trips to the ice planets and bringing back life support materials. Excuse me. More life support materials from space trips can really skyrocket the number of dupes that you can sustain on the map. So even if we only have sort of the basic guaranteed stuff on the map, a couple cool steam vents, the oil reservoirs, we can support around what we have right now. With space operations, we can potentially support a lot more. That's going to be the big problem going forward. That's what's going to drive us to do a lot of things, right? We're going to need to develop a way of cracking into the oil biome without scalding all of our duplicants. We're going to need to start processing oil into petroleum, into natural gas, getting the water from natural gas. There's a whole set of industrial systems we're going to need to produce just to sustain the duplicants that we have right now. Like, unless we find a cool slush geyser, a cool steam vent, something like that, there is a whole chain of things that we need to build just to tap into the water resources that are guaranteed on the planet. So maybe as a good rule of thumb, stop at around 24 duplicants, maybe lower even if you're kind of newer to the game, because that's going to be what is just easily sustainable off of the guaranteed water sources that you have on the map. Start scouting out your map a little bit more, find out what's available, and then go up to higher numbers of duplicants, because that's really the big thing facing this base going forward. It's going to be finding the water supplies, and I think that's ultimately going to mean going down to the bottom of the map, tapping into the oil reservoirs. It's going to mean going to the top of the map, starting up a space program. It's going to be meaning refined metals, steel. It's going to mean plastics. It's going to mean astronauts and all the training that goes into them. It's going to mean morale buildings for these astronauts as you continue along. There are a few other things that we want to tackle in the space. Closing up more areas as barracks. When we started, he basically had no areas enclosed as rooms. Now we have barracks over here, barracks over here, barracks over here, and here we have great halls set up. We've got a washroom. We've got a massage clinic, right? We want to set up these rooms because they provide you bonuses usually, right? Morale +1 for sleeping in this room. Morale +6 for eating in a great hall. Morale +2 when you go to the bathroom and a washroom. These are going to be the things that are important to include in your base and build in your base as you're going along, because that's what's going to be able to allow you to have duplicants that take on more and better and more sophisticated skills, right? That's what's going to allow them to kind of advance along this chain. In addition to that, upgrading to better foodstuffs is good, right? The transition from mealwood to mushrooms is a good thing, not just because you'll eventually run out of dirt and slime is something that you're going to have more of, but also because the mushrooms are going to provide more morale, right? A fried mushroom, if we go to consumables, if we go to consumables, a fried mushroom is going to provide morale +1, whereas raw meal lice is going to provide morale -1, right? Eventually, we probably want to work our way up to things like barbecue, have a ranching operation. Ranching operation can also provide a lot of our power. That's the other big thing that this base is going to have to develop. I haven't gone around the map and dug out a lot of coal. I have about 6 tons of it just from sort of incidental digging that I've done. But you're going to want more coal. You might be tempted, and I think it'd be fine to do it as a newer player, to use up this hydrogen as opposed to just storing it, right? Set some hydrogen generators down somewhere, start producing power off of those, because that power is often going to be necessary for a lot of your more sustainable heat management solutions, right? It's going to be what you need to use to run a thermoregulator or thermal aqua tuner that's going to heat up this water before you delete the heat with a water sieve. It's going to be what runs your pumps and your electrolysis machines, right? A new power system is going to be something that's definitely in order here. So hydrogen, digging out more areas of coal, digging down to the oil biome, getting some oil and using that. These are the sets of challenges that you're going to face going forward, right? It's going to be keeping up with your morale requirements, keeping up with your food requirements, transitioning to new food sources as you run out of the input materials for the old food sources. It's going to mean finding new sources of water for your electrolysis. That's going to include tapping in and exploring the map and finding all of the cool steam vents and cool slush geysers that you have. It's going to mean going down to the oil biome and using the oil reservoirs there. It's going to mean ultimately developing a space program to bring in new life support from other asteroids. That's the plan going forward. So I hope the series has been helpful. I hope it's been entertaining. If you out there have a base that you need fixed up, feel free to put something in the comments, right? Send me your save file and I'll consider doing another series just like this. I'm willing to take bases from all over the spectrum. If you're in an early to mid-game situation like this, right, you're cycle 120 and you're running out of food and oxygen, send me that base. If you're mid-game and you're struggling, you say, oh, I can't, my space program isn't working, or I'm having trouble getting into the oil biome or anything like this, send me your base. Even if you're late game and you say, oh, I had some disaster occur, I had some sort of regolith melting thing and it messed up, send me your base. Send me your bases, and I can do more series like this. That's going to be it for this series, though. Hope it was fun. Hope it gave a good idea of what to do in these situations, how to avoid them, and where to go from there. All right, this is Gearhead signing out.